Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. So this morning I saw a shooting star outside. I'm locked in this, I would say, damaging relationship with my Apple Watch where I have to get up and walk around every hour. And because I get up crazy early in the morning, I go outside, walk down to the edge of my driveway and back. And knowing how early I get up, that can be 5 a.m. or so. So you see things going outside depending on time of pre-dawn and the weather and all that. And a lot of mornings I open the back door and see Orion in the background through the trees behind my house. And well, last week I looked up and accidentally saw the International Space Station passing by. Had no idea what it was until somebody in my running group happened to mention that it was doing a flyover and thought, oh, well, that makes sense. But this morning I was walking back up the driveway and just saw this thing go by. And I stepped back and tried to replicate the motion of figure out if it was an artifact reflecting off my glasses or something. But no, it was one and done, a little shooting star. And that's the sort of thing you can see, I guess, when you're in the right place at the right time. And there's no iPhone and selfie and sharing and all that stuff. There's just you and the moment. Anyway, I don't know why I'm sharing that with you, but let's get to the episode. My guest this week is the celebrated British painter Celia Paul, and she has this fantastic memoir out now from New York Review Books called Self-Portrait. It came out in the UK last year, but it's just coming out here in the US. Self-Portrait explores Celia's life as an artist and the evolution of her portraiture and life painting, her need for that Virginia Woolfian room of one's own, and her 10-year relationship with Lucian Freud, which began when she was in art school at the Slade. The Self-Portrait doesn't come off as dishy or gossipy or anything about the relationship. Instead, Celia situates the relationship in her development as an artist and a person and gives us enough of who she was before meeting Freud that shows us she was headed towards an artistic life regardless. And, again, she was in art school when that began. But the book incorporates her diaries and poetry from the time with her contemporary narrative in a way that, establishes a continuity of self over the decades that I find utterly envious, because I look at journals of mine from 6 weeks ago and I can't figure out who wrote them. But Self-Portrait is this fascinating exploration of the development of an artist, but also the challenges facing women artists in particular, which, gave me some reticence about sitting down for a conversation with her because I was coming from a different direction. Anyway, she writes about having a child with Lucian and how her mother ultimately becomes the boy's primary guardian, I guess, because Celia realizes her love for her child is so great, it'll wipe out her ability to make art. And she doesn't portray the decision as like a heart-rending sacrifice or anything, which I found really refreshing. It's not cold, but it was a decision she made, and it's in the past, and she built this body of work. I mean, in the intro, she's similarly straightforward about how she lives separately from her husband, how he doesn't have a key to her apartment and studio, and that's because that's her place to make art. which may or may not sound weird. Obviously requires a good deal of understanding from the other people in one's life, but like I said, it's refreshing that an artist can choose that path and make this major body of work seemingly with an acceptance that this is who she is and what she needs to do. That Celia is one of the most important contemporary artists in Britain, and we get into the importance of being selfish in order to become that. Now, Lucian Freud's shadow hangs over Self-Portrait, and Celia is very much at ease depicting the relationship and their influences on each other's work without using the dreaded M word, muse. And we get into that. I was captivated by how she contrasts her mode of portraiture from his and how she branched away from, well, who she could paint, how sitting sessions were conducted, what the moral component of life painting is. It reminded me, weirdly, a little of how my brother and I approach a certain pinball machine with very different styles that reflect our respective outlooks on the universe. Anyway, Self-Portrait is just wonderfully written. I mean, this whole thing, everything I'm conveying to you is done in about 200 pages, including a lot of reproductions of her paintings and sketches, along with a few of Freud's, and some great photos from her past. Yeah, it's just her writing mirrors the paintings in a sense. Like they convey both her inner state and the external world. And the book is this perfect physical object to capture all that. So go get Self-Portrait. Came out from New York Review Books in the U.S. in mid-November. You can find it at better bookstores. Now, there's a caveat and a meta caveat I want to share. I haven't been doing the caveat thing lately, but because of a weird recording quirk, if I made any noise while Celia was talking, it would create this echo loop, which I discovered. So I had to be careful not to interject or do anything that might make the final audio weird for you guys. And that means when she made a joke or said something funny, I couldn't laugh. But trust me, she says a bunch of funny things deliberately during this conversation. I was laughing on the inside. I just didn't want to do that in a way that was then going to create this weird audio thing. The meta thing. I was actually kind of nervous leading into this one because, as I mentioned, Celia is one of the best regarded contemporary artists in the world. And I'm pretty unschooled about painting and the art world, and I was sort of afraid I would come off as a Philistine. And well, I always have a degree of anxiety leading into every single episode, which I like to believe gives me an edge. It was more pronounced this time. On the plus side, by the time we were done, I felt like I'd made a new pal, and it'll be weird to say, but there was a degree to which the conversation sort of felt like one of her paintings in terms of layers that kept getting added and scraped away as we got more familiar with each other's speech and lines of thought. Again, it's weird. You'll just have to listen. Just remember, it is possible for me to blather and say something important. Now, here's Celia's bio. Celia Paul was born in 1959 and studied at the Slade School of Fine Art. Her work has been exhibited internationally and is in the collections of the British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, London, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her major solo exhibitions include Celia Paul, curated by Hilton Als at the Yale Center for British Art in 2018, and the Huntington Art Museum, San Marino, California, 2019. And Desdemona for Celia by Hilton at Gallery Met, New York, 2015 and 16. Her work was included in the group exhibition All Too Human at Tate Britain, 2018. She lives and works in London, and her new book is Self-Portrait. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Celia Paul. What brought you to write Self-Portrait and to get back to writing in general?
Well, that's a question that's kind of puzzled me as well. But when I was a young woman, I did keep a kind of random diary. And then for many, many years, I stopped writing altogether until my mother died in 2015, and somehow her death kind of made me want to kind of make a whole out of my own life in the way that, so I wanted to kind of reconnect with my young self at that point in a way that is still quite a mystery to me.
Yeah. And the toughest part of returning to the journals, the old diaries?
Well, somehow the voice of my young self seemed very immediate to me, and the things that I wrote about have kind of always been with me in some way. And so it was less of a surprise than I thought it would be, and less disturbing as well.
Yeah.
There are some parts of it that deal with quite difficult, painful issues. And I was sort of quite struck by the way that by writing about these painful things, even at that young age, there was a way that I was taking control of the things that I was writing about. And that was what was the surprise, because in my memory, before I read the diary entries, I'd felt that as a young woman I was completely floundering. And in fact, the writing is quite controlled, and that struck me.
I thought it was fascinating that the book itself begins with your first encounter with Mr. Freud, and then goes earlier to your school days and the sense of how you became an artist and how deep the compulsion went. And I guess that's a non-question that gets to the question of how you chose to craft the book itself and the narrative, and when you chose to go with your present day perspective versus including sections from the diaries. Was there what was the process behind that, I guess? Some of the choices you made, or how much interaction with editorial did that involve?
Well, I think it, soon after my mother died, I actually tried to write a version of this book, and it was much more rambling and less focused. And I decided to sort of whittle it down, and in doing so, certain things became clear about how things should be placed or not. And I wanted it to kind of weave in and out a bit more like a sort of piece of music, maybe. One thing, I was never very good at writing essays or anything at school, and I always had a problem with structure to do with beginning, middle, and end. And this had kind of put me off, I think, in my first draft of this book, to try and I kind of over-structured it, and yet it somehow felt less contained than this. And in this version, I kind of wanted to suggest a timeless quality to do with shifting in and out between past and present.
That's a good term to use. I had I was struggling with describing it as dreamy and yet with utterly concrete language. And timelessness captures that sensation a lot better. So thank you very much. How did this creative process, how does it compare, or how dissimilar is it from painting for you, working in words?
Well, it is a very different process. When I'm painting, before I start work, I always try and make myself feel as still inside as possible. And painting itself is sort of not unlike, I mean, not that I can dance at all, but not unlike dance or a performance. It's a physical thing, and involves a lot of sort of physical control. And it's a very, very quiet art form in its process, for me anyway. Whereas writing, I feel, is much, much more a busier activity altogether, and it kind of seems to use a different part of me. My head and my shoulders feel much more kind of involved in the process of writing. But I think in a way, the way that it is connected is that when I'm writing, it works best if I see a picture of what I'm writing about in my head. And so that a lot, imagery is very important to me when I'm writing, because I feel that if I can't see what I'm writing about, it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Who do you feel your writing influences were? Were there particular memoirists who formed a example for you or otherwise inspired you with this?
Well, most particularly, I think I love Colette. I love this Break of Day, her memoir, which she wrote in old age when she had a young lover who she relinquishes at the end. And her memoir is kind of interwoven with letters from her own mother. And so there's a sense in her writing about past and present very much, and future as she looks towards her old age without love. And it's a tough book and very, very beautifully written, to do with her descriptions of nature are almost better than anyone's. I think it's a wonderful masterpiece. And I also love Marguerite Duras. I love, The Lover, her memoir of her childhood, when she had a relationship with a Chinese man, and there again, the past and the present are so cleverly and sort of strangely, dreamily interwoven.
Hmm. Do you feel like you got the writing bug out of this?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm working actually on a new book. It's about Gwen John, and the title is Letters to Gwen John, because I feel the letter form, letters are quite like paintings, because they live in the kind of constant present. They're kind of, and the immediacy of them. And again, the letters form their own kind of structure. I date the letters. And so the structure of the time that they were written gives a kind of narrative form to the work. And I wanted to kind of address something about how Gwen John and I have both been kind of overshadowed to some extent by the men we've been involved with. Gwen John was kind of famously involved with, had an affair with Auguste Rodin, and obviously me and Lucian Freud, and whether she and I have both to some extent chosen our overshadowing, and whether we work maybe better in the shadows, in whether we're somewhat nocturnal creatures, and whether, we both value interiority and stillness, and whether there's something deliberate about our choice of being overshadowed. And that's something I wanted to explore, because I feel with self-portrait that I feel that it needs to be followed on by addressing another woman artist to open out from not just about me, because I very much my intention for self-portrait was to address women artists particularly, and I felt it made sense to kind of explore that further by writing about another woman artist who I feel a deep connection to.
Can you talk a little about that sense of self-portrait as a testimony for women artists? As a man, I struggle with how to talk to someone with, for example, your history that doesn't involve defining you as, former lover of Lucian Freud and model, but also artist, and, how much a victim of that sort of language we all are in terms of how we define people, and women especially in this culture, which is my sheepish way of saying, can you talk about the book as a testimony for women artists and what you're aspiring to with that?
Well, I think there are two kind of phrases. One is painter in her own right, and that phrase "in her own right" is only ever really used about women, and it's a sort of indication that they're not really free to be uniquely themselves as artists. And the other, well, it's a word. I hate the word muse as well. I think I'm not alone in that. I think somebody suggested that the book should be called "We Are Not a Muse." But I think it's a particular thing that I think even now. I mean, I think things have got better for a lot of young women now compared to when I was a young woman. But I think there's still the problem of desire, really, that so it's so difficult to be ambitious about your own work and also be desirable at the same time. And I think if you want, there really does seem to me to be quite a conflict between being loved and by following your own path. And I think this is still relevant for women to try and work out now. The thing is, as I say in my book, you do have to be selfish to be an artist. And I think men are generally better at being selfish than women. And and women are seen very often as kind of supporters and carers, and rather than and it's very difficult to be in a caring role and to be selfish as well. They cancel each other out, and that's still a crucial dilemma to have to work out for women.
One of the things I found interesting, through the course of the book, was that sense of how you and Freud approach sitters in seemingly an opposite direction. I mean, early on, you talk about his need for literalness in terms of who he's painting, and your need for that sort of intimacy and connection, sort of what lies underneath. And I wondered how much you take that as a masculine versus feminine principle in art, or whether it's simply, a contrast of the two of you as individual personalities.
I think It would be too simple to say it was a male-female divide there. I think Lucian's approach to painting people is much more that of a portraitist than my approach. He liked to, when he worked from people, he liked to enter into conversation with them. And partly he did that because he wanted to see how their face moved, how their mouth worked when they were talking. If you look at his portraits, very often the mouth is in movement, and very often the eyes are cast down, which is very often what happens when people are mid-conversation. They look down or away, for him, he said concentration was everything, and the scrutiny he brought to everything, his focus, meant everything. What he saw in front of him was the thing that mattered. And I mean, obviously everyone interprets things. He wasn't but for him, he kind of found my more mystical paintings more difficult to relate to. And it's something I kind of struggled with a lot, this kind of discipline of working from life, because there seems to be a sort of moral thing in it, that there's a sort of moral purity in working from something that's in front of you. And you can get into all sorts of things that could border on, I don't know, you can lose yourself if you rely too heavily on dreams and symbolism and that kind of thing. So I wanted to do something along the lines of painters that I love particularly, like Van der Weyden or Grunewald or Ribera, where they kind of juxtapose the mystical with the what you can see in front of you. So there's a kind of reality to the visions, and I wanted to use this more and more. And a very good example of this in my own work is My Mother and God, where I juxtapose my mother, her head and shoulders at the bottom of the canvas, with this great area of darkness behind her and stretching to the top of the canvas. It's a long, narrow painting. And I wanted in this painting to contrast, when I painted this painting, she was still grieving for my father, who had died actually, 6 or 7 years before I worked on this painting, but she was still grieving for him. And I started to think about death. And I thought, one of the saddest things for me about death is that you lose the particularity of the person, the sort of the way that the mouth covers over, sticking out teeth, and the way they talk and all that kind of thing. And how can heaven or some kind of Christian idea of an afterlife, how can that ever compare to that kind of intimate knowledge of an individual? And so I contrasted my mother's head with this area of darkness, but I put just a suggestion of hope at the very top of the canvas, which is just this small beam of light, like a light coming up from behind a dark hill when the dawn is just starting, just to suggest a suggestion of hope.
To that end, do you wonder how your art would have developed without that relationship with Lucian? in your life? Do you see that contrast we talked about as sort of being in response to what he was doing, or did you see that you were headed in that direction already? I'm talking too much. Do you think about how your life would have been different?
Well, I think I might have found my way to working from nature much sooner than I have done. The paintings I did from nature were what got me into the Slade, because when I was first admitted to the Slade when I was 16, my father was head of this evangelical religious community in Devon. And I don't know if you know Devon at all, but it's very, very beautiful. And we lived right by the sea, and it was very remote. And I used to collect kind of seaweed and bits of things I found from walks through the woods, and I'd make still lives out of them. And there was a kind of energy in them that was quite charged. I used oil paint even then, and the paint was thick, and they were good. They were good paintings. And then when I started at the Slade, the emphasis was so much on life drawing, working from people, that I got interested in working from people. But I found I couldn't work from the life model because she didn't mean anything to me. And so I started to work from my mother, and immediately I realized that this is what I wanted to do, and that the fact that I loved her was what gave the authenticity to the work. And so I'd just before I met Lucian, who came to be a tutor at the Slade, when I was 18, I'd been at the Slade 2 years by the time I met him. I'd already started to work from my mother, and I'd been very impressed with an exhibition I'd seen a few months before I'd met him, in which he'd painted his mother. So the paintings that struck me most in the exhibition were paintings of his mother. And so I felt a deep connection to him at that point, because I felt that what gave his work the particular force it has was because he worked from people he was close to, and that's what I wanted to do too. But I think I have been kind of deflected. I was deflected from my purpose through being influenced by him in one crucial aspect, that he was very, very influenced. I mean, he was very, very interested in the balances of power between people, between lovers particularly. And when I was with him, I did this painting of a man and his girlfriend, and I made the man stand and take up most of the canvas, and then all you could see of his girlfriend was her head at the bottom of the canvas. And in fact, they split up during the time of this painting, and I kind of had foreseen this at first, because I think the power balance between them was very uneven. And it was soon after I'd painted this painting that Lucian did a very similar structured painting of Angus Cook and his lover Kerith Wyn Evans, his lover at the time, Kerith Wyn Evans, and I think Lucian kind of used a similar kind of structure to define a sort of a power balance that maybe was uneven between the two of them. And similarly, one of the figures is standing, and the head of the other is just visible at the bottom of the canvas. And so even though Lucian painted this after I'd painted my version, I think I would never have painted that painting if I hadn't been involved with Lucian Freud at the time.
I know it's going to sound like an absolutely odd non sequitur, but this reminds me of when I've interviewed people who are gag cartoonists for The New Yorker, who are married to another gag cartoonist at The New Yorker, and whether they basically hide jokes from each other for fear that the other one's going to steal them. Anyway, that's a, a complete oddball aside of mine. But
Yeah.
I do wonder, you brought up the, sort of returning to nature painting. How has painting changed for you? What do the years bring? I talk so often with writers, primarily writing as their art form. But for you as a painter, what have the decades brought you?
I think they have brought me to some extent to freedom. I think when I started, I was very kind of much more conscious of the hours I put into working. Painters tend to boast about how many hours they put in. They like everyone to know how hard they're working. And so, they say, oh, I worked 18 hours today. And, everyone at the Slade was always boasting about how many hours they put in. And that's something that, both Lucian Freud and Frank Auerbach used to be tremendously proud of how they worked throughout the day and throughout the night, and their stamina meant a lot to them. And this was quite difficult, this kind of guilt trap about the hours you put in. And so I got into that to begin with, and sort of pushed myself on working, when really it might have been easier to step back. And so there was often in my earlier work a sort of strain, I think, from that reason. But also, I think some of my early self-portraits are full of a kind of over-earnestness. I think I've come to accept myself in a more freeing way now, and that shows in my more recent self-portraits. I think now I've realized that my stamina, my energy is very, very different. It works in ebbs and flows quite naturally. And I've noticed that when I start a painting, I need to take it slowly. And then as I become more and more caught up with it, it's hard to step away from it, and I work longer hours. But it's beside the point how many hours you put in, and that's been quite a freeing thing for me to think about. And I think more and more I've used stillness in my work. It's become both more still and more free, I think.
This is a weird association I made over the course of reading the book. But as I mentioned before, we're recording remotely, of course, now, but before the pandemic, I always did these in person. And part of that was that I would simply look at the other person for an hour or two during conversation and just read them, listen to what they're saying, but also just look at their face, look at, read the way they're talking, and just try and sort of lose myself within, gazing on another person and not looking at screens and doing anything else, which I guess, it's an incredibly broad question, but tell me about the act of looking and what it does, and how you can segment that with somebody sitting for you versus can you turn your eye off, basically, in day-to-day life? Tell me about the act of looking, I suppose.
Yes, no, that's a very interesting question. I think my mother, this is a kind of, again, possibly a wide reading of what you've just asked, but my mother used to think that I had become a painter because I had such good eyesight. And I used to say to her, this used to irritate me, and I used to say that, one of the greatest painters was nearly blind when he did some of his greatest paintings, Edgar Degas. And so, but I've kind of thought about that since her death, and wondered if, because I'm very, very long-sighted in my right eye and very short-sighted in my left eye. And when I work from life, I use my right eye and I stand back from the figures and the forms, the figures really. I think I only work from people, from life. My places and seascapes, I can't describe it as being memory, but it's more I dream them up. But when I'm working from life, it's a very, very different process. It has a different risk to it. It's more like the difference, I suppose, between kind of theatre and film, maybe, that I'm aware of the person in front of me, even though there's silence between us. I don't enter into conversation with my sitters. I like, in a way, for them to almost forget that I'm there at my easel. And I like to kind of watch the way they affect the air around them. And people do affect the air around them. It washes around them almost like a kind of liquid, like a stream around a rock or something. And so this is something I kind of engage in when I'm looking at them. And this is one of the reasons why I only ever work from people I know well, because if I work from somebody I don't know well, I have to kind of measure the distance between their nose and their mouth and the distance between their eyes and that kind of thing. And it's a much more pedantic kind of interpretation of them. Whereas if I know them well, I can take all sorts of liberties with their form and it's still kind of them. I think I'm more interested in presence rather than a kind of physical likeness. And but when I'm kind of dreaming up my seascapes, say, or my trees, they come from quite a different place, and I think I use my left eye more. I'm much closer to the canvas, and I use whatever kind of paint rags happen to be at hand, and hardly notice what I'm doing at all, but they seem to happen in a quite different way.
You mentioned how you have to know the sitter well. How well do they know you? I know it's family, but how well do they know Celia?
Well, I'm particularly close to my younger sister, Kate. I'm one of four sisters, and I'm the fourth. And I think they know me well, but I think Kate and I know each other so well that we hardly need to speak, and because we know what we're thinking. And a lot of the portraits I've done of Kate are almost self-portraits by proxy, really. She expresses what I feel through the portraits of her. But I think there's nobody else in the world that I have felt that uncanny connection to with Kate. But I'm not sure how well many people know me. There are times when I feel a kind of instant connection to someone. It happened quite recently, and it's exciting and mysterious when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I not tooting my own horn, I do this every week, so it's a very different experience in that way. I always joke that it's a form of vampirism. Basically, I get an hour or so of somebody else's life, and then I step back, and they don't have to find out how shallow I really am, or find out anything else about my life. But it is an interesting thing to have this long body of work of yours that's so focused ultimately on a narrow range of people, in addition to the seascapes and the other items or the other paintings that you work on. Sorry, no question, just me kind of cogitating in the air.
Yes,
But
yeah.
yeah. Do you work with younger artists in any sort of mentoring way? I know, like we said, the book is sort of a testimony for women artists, but do you interact with quote unquote the art world or with artists in particular?
I do have a very close artist friend actually who lives in New York, and she and I correspond um, frequently, and we have very interesting conversations. And she has described me as a mentor. I've tried teaching. I try teaching at the Slade actually, and I know that a lot of painters find teaching really energizing, and it inspires them to. And I wish it was the same for me. I do find it inspiring, but I find it so completely exhausting that I'm not able to kind of work for days and days afterwards. And because you have to be in teaching, you have to be so kind of receptive to what the painters and artists are doing, that it kind of completely drains me when I do that. And I would love it not to be so. I would love to be able to be much more fully engaged with young artists properly than I am. And so in a way, I'm hoping that by writing and actually through my painting, I might be able to talk to them through those means. But yeah.
And you haven't been tempted to take up the David Hockney iPad painting or anything like that, I assume?
Well, I'm very, very inept technically, really. But no, I haven't yet. No, I mean, the nearest to that is I love printmaking, and I've done printmaking throughout my life, actually, particularly this technique called soft ground etching, which is when a copper plate is you roll beeswax over a copper plate and then put a piece of tissue paper over it, and you draw with a pencil onto the tissue paper. And then when the plate is bitten in acid, the print shows your drawing, so it has the quality of a pencil drawing. And I love it because you can get all sorts of mysteries to do with the background life of the plate, which, little scratches and I remember I did this print of my friend Kerith with Wyn Evans, the artist, and it was of his head and shoulders, and I put the plate down on the carpet, and he was wearing these very big boots and he trod on the plate, and the boot mark came out in the print with these great wonderful scoring lines, and it actually added to the life of the print altogether. And I love that thing of chance with printmaking, and so yeah, but I haven't done iPad drawings yet, no.
Are there other forms or modes of art you've considered or wanted to experiment with?
No, I think in a way writing is my biggest experiment so far. I do a lot of pen and ink drawings, and I do very big watercolors. I've just finished a very big watercolor of it's of my husband, Stephen Kupfer, and people always think of watercolors as being supposed to be done on small scale, and they're usually nature. But I did this big watercolor, which was about 6 foot square, of my 4 sisters with me reflected in the in the mirror behind. And what I love about watercolor is that paper is such a beautiful surface to work on. And so that I like to, when you leave a white space in a watercolor on the form, say, of one of my sisters, the white space it's like you carve the form out of the paper, and the white space is like the highlight on the forms. And I love the way I always paint watercolors vertically. The paper is actually, I mount them on canvas, the paper on canvas, to give it a kind of bounce to when I'm working on it. And with the watercolor, it drips, so you get a real sense of the vertical nature, and so that. And I'm very conscious of the kind of the grid on paper, and I love to use the kind of the vertical lines running through paper and the horizontal lines, so that to weave in the kind of marks of the paint, so almost like notes in music.
Yeah, I did a podcast with a watercolorist named Antonio Massi late last year, who similarly works on the large scale, and I'd never seen until I was at his home 6 foot by 6 foot sort of watercolors before. It's amazing to see. It's something that we're so accustomed to thinking of on a smaller scale.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Now, tell me, there's a section about 3/4 of the way through the book where you talk about painting as destruction. I'll quote a couple of lines. You say painting is the language of loss, the scraping off of layers of paint. This is getting away from the watercolor stuff, of course, but the scraping off of layers of paint again and again, the rebuilding, the losing again, hoping, then despairing, then hoping. Can you talk about how you came to that conclusion about painting and that sense of it, as you've mentioned, the way mentioned earlier, the way it's accretive but also destructive in the process, and what painting and time mean to you, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, I think painting has this particular relation to time. There is no way of saving a painting. If you need to rework something, you need to kind of destroy the whole painting, because a painting is a kind of balancing act. So if one bit of a painting doesn't work, then the whole thing will collapse. And so you have to be really ruthless. And I've got rid of paintings that I've been very pleased with, but that I know need to get deeper, to go deeper. And I've also got rid of paintings where just one part of the painting I was really, really pleased with, and I've had to destroy the whole thing. And it's an extremely painful process. And I've been kept awake at nights by kind of driving myself insane by remembering what I've lost in the painting. And images that I've painted over kind of remorselessly come back to me to haunt me, and think, why did I do that? Why, and I don't, for that reason, I don't, well, not often anyway, I don't take photographs of my paintings in the process that they're making, because I think I could drive myself completely insane by looking back over what I actually painted out. And so I started to question why I am putting myself through this kind of act of destruction, this destructive process of painting, in order to go deeper. And you somehow need to push yourself to that point of crisis, so that you have kind of lost everything, so that it's you are completely in the dark, and somehow you I mean, it is in a way connected to prayer. You're actually calling on some supernatural help to help you through this and to make it somehow happen almost despite yourself in the end at that point of crisis, that you can't have any preconceived ideas of what you want because the situation is too risky at this crisis point when you've lost everything and starting again. So I kind of started to question why I did this, and I just wondered if it was somehow a way of controlling loss in my life. I mean, I find loss a very difficult thing. I find, getting over a relationship an extremely painful and difficult thing to deal with. And obviously, after the death of someone you love, it takes a long time to recover. And whether by this kind of process of painting I could control this sort of pain so that it doesn't become overwhelming. And I wondered if maybe this has something to do with it.
I wonder how much your parents' religious background, from the book, you've conveyed that you don't have that sense of organized religion by any means, but how much that plays into that well, what you were just discussing about loss and trying to cope with what comes after.
I think I do find religion quite difficult to talk about because it is sort of part of my life and always has been. But I do find, as you say, I do find organized religion kind of antipathetic to my own nature. I don't like the emphasis on, it being a club and that some people are included and some excluded. I find that it doesn't speak to me at all. But all through my childhood, especially when I was a little child in India, the day always began with prayers in my father's study and ended with prayers. And I think in prayer, the kind of emphasis on loss of ego, it being not about yourself, and that that has helped me a lot, as well as the discipline of prayer as well, has given a kind of structure to my life and work. And obviously the emphasis on goodness as well, which I think I do value truth in art very, very almost beyond anything. So I think that's a connection as well to my early upbringing.
How did your view of Lucian change in the decade since his death?
Yes, I think I hadn't fully been aware when he was alive that how much, even though we weren't kind of sexually involved towards the end, he was very central to my life. He's the father of my son, and so we had that connection all through, and also the connection of the art. And I did continue to love him, even though I wasn't in love with him towards the end. And so I think I hadn't been fully aware when he was alive just how much he still affected my life. And so when he died, it wasn't exactly as if I was freed by his death, but I did start to feel liberated. And I'd been at the same gallery had represented me for 25 years, Marlborough Fine Art. And I started to think I need a change. And I wrote to various galleries, and this director of the Pallant House Gallery in Chichester decided to put on an exhibition of my work and Gwen John's through the letter that I'd written to the director. And Victoria Miro saw this exhibition, and I'm now represented by Victoria Miro, and I feel very free compared to when Lucian was alive. He died, he'll have been dead 10 years ago next July, and I realise that it's since 2011 that I've truly felt free, which interests me.
Mm-hmm. I'd wondered about that in relation to, throughout your life, you've been, as you said, sort of defined, in that role, and that stuck as muse, stuck as model or sitter for him, and whether that changed after, and how much of that, the seeds of that was leading up to this moment in your life.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think, when he died, I was actually taken unawares that I hadn't quite seen clearly how I was regarded by the world. I was shocked that so many of the obituaries where I was mentioned, it didn't even say that I was a painter. They just said I was Lucian Freud's muse and lover. And this shocked me, because my whole life I've been dedicated to my art, and lived by my art as well, financially, and so to be just regarded as his model and lover, muse, that disgusting word, and lover, just really, really shocked me. So I thought I have to do something about this. And so this, in a way, was what gave me courage to try to change my life at that point.
And with the book, was there any temptation towards a score settling or issues? I mean, you portray the relationship, in various episodes without it, seemingly without grinding an axe, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, no, I do.
Yes. Yeah, and how how much was that? Well, what temptations were there, or was that essentially you're where you are now? This is what the relationship meant and what it was like.
Well, I think in the prologue to my book, I kind of talk about how in the diaries I wrote as a young woman, I wrote some poems as well. And I mean, although they're not good poems, they kind of gave a sense of distance. I describe it as being a kind of bird's eye view, and trying to make a kind of beauty out of what was very often very turbulent events which were happening in my life, and upsetting things between me and Lucian. But somehow to write the poems, you kind of could get a bird's eye view on things. And the thing about art is there always does have to be a certain distance on everything, or else it doesn't work with authenticity. And I very much wanted to get that quality in my writing as well as in my painting. Yes, and that's really what my aim was. I think there's this, the famous essay by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, although she obviously admires Charlotte Bronte and thinks she's a very great writer, she also felt that the work was flawed because of Charlotte Bronte's anger, and she compares her to Jane Austen, who was so perfectly controlled and no kind of anger bursting out at the seams at all. And that quality of control is something I wanted to get as well.
Which kind of brings me around to the elephant in the room aspect of this entire world right now. How is the pandemic affecting less life and more art? Are you able to work with sitters? How's your pandemic going is sort of my baseline question.
Well, when it first happened, when the first lockdown in London happened, it was extremely marked, the difference in my life. I live in one of the busiest streets in London, and the traffic goes roaring by, the roadworks and crowds of tourists. And then suddenly there was silence. And for 2 months, I didn't see anybody. And so I had all this silence to myself. And it kind of coincided with a particularly extraordinarily beautiful spring, day after day of bright sunshine. So in a way, it felt like quite an extraordinary, almost magical time for me and for my work. I missed people. I mean, when it first happened, I was nearly, flayed with longing to see people I loved. But I kind of did channel that loneliness into my work, and I'm actually very pleased with what I've done this year. I've been very, very prolific. I missed I've got 2 grandchildren, a 4-year-old granddaughter and a 2-year-old grandson, and they live in Cambridge. And I'd been going to see them regularly, and then I couldn't, and I was quite heartbroken about that. And so, but when in June we were allowed to kind of see each other, although not touch each other, I got a dawn train to Cambridge, and I was the only person on the train, and I did a painting actually of that. I saw a fox in a field in the dawn light, and I did a painting of that. And then when I first saw my granddaughter, our mouths just dropped open. We couldn't believe we'd actually were seeing each other in true life, and it was extremely moving and intense. But my son, their father, was very, very strict about social distancing, so we weren't allowed to go near each other. But still, it was quite overwhelmingly moving to see her again. And yes, and things now seem sort of, I don't know, much more ragged, and obviously politically and everything. I mean, obviously in the States, it's, it must be so extraordinarily frightening and intense at the moment, and it just feels like one of those times which you can't believe how many things are kind of coming together and making it almost unbearably intense at times.
Just coincidentally, one of my best friends sent me a postcard this morning where he asked, we had a conversation last week, and he said he forgot to ask then, but does it legitimately feel like the end of the world? He wasn't talking facetiously, so, but just pandemic, fires in California, everything else going on. Does it sort of feel like we're in the end times? Neither of us are religious, but I confess that, yes, there are reasons I'm very happy I never had children, because God knows what this world's going to be like, 10, 20 years from now.
Yes. I think it certainly feels like the ending of an era, whatever that means. I think whatever happens, when we do kind of come out of this terrible dark tunnel, we'll come out and things will be very, very changed. And I think what I say to myself, that I've got to try and be receptive to this change. I'm not at home with technology at all. And I think probably the new world that we find ourselves in will be very, very reliant on technology. And I want to be open to that as well, and to be able to, there'll be a new language of art, I think, will start to evolve. And I think we'll all have to be tremendously receptive to newness, because young people will be just discovering life from the beginning. And so we'll have to be aware of that.
I'll say, despite your tech aversion, you've done a great job so far with all this. So I appreciate it. But it's true, I've had to figure out what angle makes me look least offensive with web cameras and doing all these video conference calls and stuff. It's been an adventure, but that's the moving self-portrait, I suppose, where we're constantly looking over at the little tile that has our own picture to make sure we're not doing something embarrassing.
Yes.
It's quite different. But last question then, besides Cambridge, where else would you love to go if you could go travel right now?
Well, I actually, in February 2019, I went to Los Angeles for the first time, because Hilton Als had curated an exhibition for me at the Huntington Museum, and I'd been very frightened about it beforehand, but I loved it there. So I wouldn't mind going back there at some point. But the place kind of on my immediate agenda at the moment is that to do with the Gwen John book. I really need to get to Dieppe in France, in Normandy, because that's where she died. In fact, she travelled from Paris to Dieppe because she wanted one last sight of the sea. She knew she was dying, and so as soon as I can, I'd like to go to Normandy.
And although I hate jinxing authors like this, I can't wait to see that book too, and I hope we get to reconnect when that comes around.
Oh, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope properly to meet you at some point. I'm looking into a completely dark computer screen at the moment.
It should all be fine. I'll send over a picture so you can get some idea of who you've been talking to, but nothing that you need to draw or paint afterwards, so that's okay. But Celia, thanks so much for coming on. I adored self-portrait, and I've already got a list of people I want to give copies to here in the States. So thank you very much for making it too.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And that was Celia Paul. Her new book is Self-Portrait, out in the U.S. from New York Review Books. I enjoyed the heck out of it. I think artists in general will find it really worthwhile, and women artists in particular may find plenty to inspire and or challenge their worldview. It is a gorgeous book. I can't recommend it highly enough. So go get it from better bookstores. Celia, as near as I could tell, has no social media presence or website. And that's probably an extension of her need for privacy, which I respect even more now. You can check out her work at the Victoria Miro Gallery, and there'll be a link to that in the show notes for this one. Now, in the before time, this is when I would mention my Patreon and PayPal and how you can support the show and blah, blah, blah. You can support the show by writing to me about it or tweeting and sharing it on social media and all that stuff. Send me a postcard, letter, email, whatever. But as far as financial support goes, I don't need it for the show. I'm doing just fine, and my expenses are really low, because of this whole situation. There are, however, a lot of people and institutions in need right now. So if you are in a position to help people, there are Kickstarters, Indiegogos, GoFundMes, Patreons, whatever. There are plenty of institutions like food banks, freedom funds, etc. A lot of places can use help right now. So if you're in a position to help fix the world a little bit, then I hope you will. Last note, I still have a few copies left of the first issue of my first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, remaining. It's free. If you want one, just drop me a line and send me your mailing address, and I will get it out to you. You can also visit haikuforbusinesstravelers.com. There's a form there to fill out. There is no content besides the print version, so you'll need to give it a read. Like I say, it's free, but you can kick in a few bucks for postage and production if you want. But I don't need you to do that. This was about me trying to share my art, such as it is. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.